MusicalTalk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of MusicalTalk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and I can't help but notice that this episode is being broadcast approximately 9 days before Christmas, which I'm sure will remind you, as it reminds me, of the song 12 Days to Christmas from the wonderful 1963 musical She Loves Me, which features a wonderful description of the people who go Christmas shopping in fairly good time, 9 days before Christmas. These are the people who plan their days wisely and well. These are the people who shop in time, and they can go to hell. Well, just a little bit of Christmas spirit. No ice in that, thank you. As we lead into Christmas. And at this time of year, it's traditional to look back. And so in this week's episode, we're going to conclude our 5-episode review of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe and its musicals from this summer in August 2024. There's plenty more to discuss here on Musical Talk about musicals from this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe, but this episode today is the last where we're doing general reviews. The future episodes are actually going to be interviews with the writers, the directors, the actors, and all the other creatives to do with those shows. And today, I'm joined again by the wonderful Colm Malloy, composer in his own right, but also long-term Musical Talk presenter. And we're going to be again talking about 3 shows. And 3 incredibly different shows. There's Wallis, about the woman who married Edward VIII, and in the process of so doing, triggered the abdication crisis of 1936, which is such an important part of British history. A show called Behind the Curtain, and a show called Mary, Mary, Quite Contrary. And frankly, if you want to pick 3 shows at random, which show you the breadth of possibilities for musical theatre at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe every year, you'd have to go a long way to find 3 better examples with what you can do with the format of musical theatre. Now, I'm not going to waste your time, but before we get into that conversation with Colm about these 3 shows, let me read you the blurb of each of them so you can have a sense of what those shows were about. And we're going to go in reverse order. So we'll start, at least in terms of descriptions, with Wallis. And the blurb for this was, after their success with 2023's Guilty of Love, Bramwell Brand's latest musical tells the story of a woman swept away by circumstance and the king who gave up his crown for her. Prince Edward, bored with the constraints of monarchy, falls in love with an American divorcee, Wallis Simpson, and gives up everything for her. Fans of The Crown will immediately recognise the first enactment of this royal twisted tale in the story of Wallis Simpson. But is it a love story, or is she a woman trapped by her own ambition, fuelled by the eye of the media? And without revealing too much, Wallis was a marvellous show, and you'll be hearing a lot more about it in the new year. It's a show to keep your eye out for, because it deserves a future. But in today's episode, the show that Colm and I will be talking about before we discuss Wallis is Behind the Curtain, a family-friendly musical. And this is its description. What goes on behind the theatre curtain? Who's that scampering about backstage? And why have they added Febreze to the dry ice machine? When Lily bottles her acting audition for the school musical, she reluctantly finds herself backstage, working with an eccentric group of characters who have made the world behind the curtain their home. Can she find her place, prove her worth, and discover her voice, all the while avoiding the wrath of the show's leading lady and the pointy edges of the backstage furniture? A new musical comedy that celebrates tales of teamwork, friendship, and courage. A very enjoyable show from Dragon Drama Company. And before that, and the show that we're going to be starting the discussion with today, is Mary, Mary, Quite Contrary, a brand new spoof adult musical with a speech marks happy ending, close speech marks. Born in Edwardian England, Mary Whitehouse was a religious moral campaigner and thorn in the side of the BBC in the 1960s and 70s during its modernisation, from its formal and stead outlook when it began in 1923. The social and sexual revolution in the swinging 60s and 70s demanded greater freedoms for people who wanted pop music, fashion and consensual, sexy fun. So how did Mary end up at a fetish party in a swingers club? And what happened? And that's a new show by Creative Theatre, CRE number 8, IVTHEATRE.co.uk. Well, there we are. 3 very, very different shows, as you can tell. And having introduced what they are, I don't want to be accused by the great composer Thomas Fats Waller of offering up all that meat but no potatoes. So let's get on with that conversation with Colm Malloy and myself, where we talk about Wallis, Behind the Curtain, and Mary, Mary, Quite Contrary. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Before we go any further, let me ask you a question. Yeah, there was a show called Mary, Mary, Quite Contrary.
Yes.
Which was about an imagined event in the life of Mary Whitehouse's life. Did you, as a man who's blessed with youth, really know anything about Mary Whitehouse before you went in? So,
I knew the name. Perhaps if I were pushed, I could have hazarded a guess that she was small c conservative with slightly draconian views, but I think that was probably it.
She may have been big K conservative as well.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, she is remembered in this country, not dead now, as a morality campaigner. And morality campaigners generally sit on the side of small c conservatism. They want to stop morality changing. She was a high churchgoer, and she didn't like what she was seeing on television and radio, and particularly in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and to a degree the 80s. She made it into the 90s, but by that time, oddly enough, she had sort of become a celebrity on television for her views because she was a household name. So she would be invited on chat shows. And there's a famous clip of her very late on where she's appearing on a Channel 4 live telephone programme. And it's a kind of sort of all bells and whistles youth programme, YOOF. And someone phones her up. It's still telephone. She's sitting in a booth with telephones along with other celebrities, and someone just phones her up and swears at her, and she doesn't know how to take it. There's a kind of sort of cheesy grin into the camera and go, oh, that's not very nice, is it?
So she's become a bit of a laughing stock.
Well, she always sort of had been, and yet at the same time, she spoke for some people in the country who did not like the way the country was going, ostensibly, let's call it, the changes that arose in the 60s more than anything else. And she harangued the BBC for things we would now say look pretty tame. But you know, there's files of paperwork that she sent to the Director General of the BBC in the 1960s, a man by the name of Hugh Carlton Green, who was pushing. He was trying to make sure that the BBC reflected the period of its time, not unlike where we are now, actually. And there are a number of people, as you know, who strongly object to what the BBC is doing because they see it as woke and modern, but actually it's trying to reflect trends as they're going forward. And it's not for me to say, but it is possible that the people who are arguing against that are the ones who don't want anything to change, which of course is a King Canute position. And you may spell that any way you like. She was doing the same thing in the 60s and 70s in particular. You know, she famously objected to a particular Doctor Who cliffhanger as being too scary for children. And the BBC then edited it to be different on all subsequent repeats. She objected to Tim Brooke-Taylor wearing a pair of underpants with a carrot on the front in the Goodies in an episode in the 1980s. So there are questions about how far she was taking things.
Reminds me, feels like such a tangent, but it reminds me of this Christopher Hitchens anecdote where he talks about how women of a certain age used to be frustrated by seeing profanities in the dictionary, and I don't even know if this is true or not, but it was a witty retort of them writing to editors of the dictionary saying, we're so pleased that you've gotten rid of all of these rude words, and the dictionary editors say, well, we commend your steadfast ability for always looking them up. So it's kind of almost this people looking for things that are to get angry about.
And that's always been the paradigm. But she was the face of that, and like a lot of organisations of that type, it's not remembered now, except through Mary Whitehouse. People will not remember the Viewers and Listeners Guild, or whatever it was called, because no one was able to take over from her. She made it an industry, and it has to be said, I think, that she was also not averse to making herself famous in the process. So there's always been this odd dichotomy about Mary Whitehouse, but she's mostly remembered as being someone who did not want to see things change in terms of her morality, which was set very firmly in the early part of the 20th century. That is the background to Mary Whitehouse. We need to explain that, because there will be a lot of people who are not British. There will be a lot of people who are British but are young, who have never heard of her, because she has passed into history. However, tell me about Mary, Mary, quite contrary.
This is a spoof adult show that reimagines or hypothesizes what would have happened were Mary told to put her money where her mouth is, and rather than call for these outrageous things that were being shown on TV to be shelved, instead have an editing hand in them, forcing her to be on the ground, on the front line, as it were. Yeah, to confront them. And so...
Which, of course, is the one thing she never wanted to do.
She never wanted to confront them.
Yeah, there was no...
She wanted to sit in her ivory tower and...
complain about other people, yes, quite.
So the director general of the BBC says that he's got on the table a documentary about swingers, and suggests that...
I'm going to have to briefly explain. I'm sure most people do know what swingers are, but do you want to clarify?
I'll let you do it.
Oh, jolly good. As it's understood, these are quite often couples who are in open relationships and invite other couples and others round, basically for what used to be called wife-sharing parties, but are basically
put your car keys in the
tray, and you swap. Basically, you used to swap wives. And it turned out that the code for this in the 70s, although this only became apparent many years later, so it could be an urban myth, was if you had pampas grass growing in your front garden, you were a swinger, allegedly. But anyway, yeah.
I think the clue is now is a pineapple or something.
Oh, is it?
Like that. Yeah.
Pineapple in the window?
Yeah, it was something like that.
Is it now? Well, I'll keep my eye open for that. But if someone tries to insert a pineapple, you will have your eyes open.
You and Mrs Thos.
Yes, my lovely wife. You've absolutely hit the nail on the head that, so this imagines what would happen if she'd taken up the opportunity to go in with a cameraman to a swingers party, which is essentially a sex party by people who may be married to each other, but there are other people doing it. So how does it come across on stage, and what do we get?
I have to say I really enjoyed this.
Can I say, you enjoyed it so much you instructed me that I should see it?
Yeah, for a variety of reasons, and I think this show knows what it's doing. It's falling into the spoof trope. There's an element of parody and wink, wink, nudge, nudge going on to the audience. Look at what we're doing. Isn't this funny? Yeah. And it is in a way. And so Mary herself gets acquainted with the people at this swingers club, the things they get up to, the fact that it's all consensual, it's all safe. It's quite educative in a way, both for her and for us audience members. It's all generally quite fun. There are two moments I'm still not sure on. The first...
But I know what one of them is, so let's hear.
The first moment, actually, I've completely forgotten, but the first song of the show, which takes place, it's this chorus number, and it's got nothing to do with the swingers club. It's kind of got nothing to do with Mary Whitehouse. It's more, here's the context of Britain at the time, but it's very tabloid heavy, and actually I found it a bit...
aggressive?
A bit shocking. Offensive is the wrong word, but I'm still not sure what it was trying to do, because I think it was on one level trying to say sexual liberalism is a good thing. Meanwhile, we were being kind of spammed with here's a lyric about Gary Glitter, here's a line about Jimmy Savile. I couldn't put those things together, and I felt like, oh, is this actually going to be quite a sexually illiberal show? What's the point here? That it's
illiberal, yes, quite.
So there was that. I'd be intrigued to know what your thoughts are on that. The other moment was maybe about 2/3 of the way through, where we have this trans character who is portrayed as being a bit of a social outcast. I'm not sure when this show is set. So,
well, I think it has to be set sometime in the 60s, but I agree with you. The references to Gary Glitter and Jimmy Savile would make that. It could be any time between about 1966 and about
2015.
2015, yeah.
Anyway, we have this trans character who describes herself as a social outcast, and I suppose the upshot of that is, being here, she feels a sense of belonging. What I found really interesting about the song, and perhaps unintentionally funny, I don't know if you spotted it, but we have the main couple who own the
venue.
Own the venue, the fringe venue, if you like. At that point in the song...
Sorry, I'm going to have to say something terrible.
Okay.
I think you'll find it was a venue.
Oh, Thos.
I know, I hate myself, and I do apologise.
There's one point during the song where that couple are off stage, and whilst this trans woman is singing this very sincere song, it's probably the only sincere song, it's the most sincere song in the show. This couple return from back off stage, and it's almost as if I remember the guy's doing his flies up, and the woman is wiping her cheek. Again, there's a real conflict going on in terms of you're undermining the points you're trying to make. Any sincerity, you're quickly throwing under the carpet.
Or contrasting with something else, quite.
So those two moments really stood out for me as, what do you want right now from me as an audience member? Because this opening is shocking. This moment is awful in a way. But also, the show is a joke in a way, and I loved it for that reason. So I can't help but think those two moments are just there for the sheer hilarity.
For the sake of it?
Yeah.
I think there's an element of for the sake of it all the way through. Interestingly, those 2 points are not the point. I thought, I'm not quite sure what I make of this.
Okay.
So let's address them one by one, because there's a few other points I want to pick up as well.
I'm sure there are, yeah.
Yes. From my point of view, although it was a musical, I would not argue that the music was particularly brilliant. You remember some of the lyrics, I think.
Yes, not off the top of my head, but the lyrics are mostly rhyming couplets.
Yeah.
I quickly discovered they were rhyming couplets, and not subtext heavy. They were to the point.
This song is about sex.
Yes.
It is just about sex. Yes. Yeah. But I enjoyed them enough. The piece worked for me as a narrative, but I want to address a couple of your points. I agree with you. I thought I wasn't going to like it quite early on, because after the framing scene at the beginning where she's talking to the Director General, who then sets up the circumstance, and then the next thing we see, she's rather nervously entering this house where the swinging party is about to take place with her cameraman.
Yes.
I must say, he's got a portable camera, which was not the case in 1960s. So, it is playing fast and loose with the timescale to tell its story, but that's fine. And you're right, there's a comment quite early on in the piece, and I can't remember if it's in narration or it comes out in the text, but it's basically, Mary Whitehouse was against X, Y and Z, and isn't that terrible, but she had some right ideas. She just focused them in the wrong direction, and that sort of is the arc of the plot, because I'm afraid we will have to talk spoilers here. At the end she comes round, as it were, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But she changes her moral position and embraces sex in its own right as a good thing, and then uses her ire and public position to weed out hypocrisy, people abusing their sexual position, this, that and the other. So she's sort of recast as a force for good once she's got over her fear of sex, shall we say. Now, I find that very difficult to square with someone who, from real life, I remember the real Mary Whitehouse, and her I'm not talking about sex per se, I'm talking about everything. She had a very small, and I hope people won't be offended by this, but old-fashioned Christian attitude. She wasn't big on gay, she wasn't big on sex, she wasn't big on this, she wasn't big on that. I find it quite difficult to recast her as a good guy, which I think was what this piece was trying to do, saying if only she'd been focused on something else, she'd been rather wonderful. And I don't think that's the case. And I want to make a similarity here with a show I saw many years ago called UKIP the Musical, when UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, was being led by one Nigel Farage. This is before the referendum, the Brexit referendum. And the writers, I went to see this musical because I was intrigued as to what they were going to do, and what they wanted to do was exactly the self-same thing. They wanted to take an idealised version of the Nigel Farage character, and they wanted to detach him from the things that were happening in UKIP that they didn't like, which in this case was the anti-immigration position, but making the champion of Brexit and the things they did like, which was what they wanted, which was clearly they did want a referendum and they did want to leave the European Union. I'm not here to talk about the politics of that. This is what the story was doing. So, and then it contrived it so that actually he sort of leaves UKIP and it collapses and he sets up a new party, which then goes into government with the Conservatives in a post-European Britain without any of the racist stuff. I will leave it for listeners to judge as to whether that's happened, but that was the position they were taking. So it felt like wish fulfillment that the authors were trying to take a character who had a particular set of things attributed to them, and then shear them of the things they didn't like in order to then put them on a pedestal. And this show, Mary Quite Contrary, seemed to be doing the same thing, but they obviously found enough in Mary Whitehouse to admire, but they wanted to give her this imaginary world where she would have been a force for good. I find it hard to fathom, but go on.
I think you using the word imaginary is important here, because I think what's hard about this show and what sounds hard about UKIP the Musical as well is that these characters are still real people ultimately, but I think it's kind of a alternative history.
Yes.
If that's perhaps what they're trying to do. What would have happened who would Mary Whitehouse be if she had gone to this, is what I imagine a dramaturg could come in and ask the cast or the creative team behind the show to consider. Yeah.
But because they were trying to do this thing where they would have their cake and eat it, that's why I think we had these songs which were saying, the one you particularly identified, she was opposed to all this, but actually look at these other things which were a real problem, and if only she turned her teeth, bared her teeth into those, we'd remember her very differently. But she didn't. She wasn't one. She wouldn't have approved of any of that either, in fairness, because it's very hard to approve of any of that, because it's all, sexual abuse is irredeemable. But she wouldn't, she would not have gone for that. She was all for keeping that kind of thing in the bedroom, and no one would ever have discussed it. It was actually much more about conspiracy of silence. So I have a real problem squaring the person. However, in the context of this imaginary Mary Whitehouse story, I found myself really unexpectedly moved. And this is the thing. So much like the narrative story level than the musical level, at the narrative level, she learns, and you see her. So the actress, well done. You see her sort of stop being quite so a stern, unbending position. To quote Lord Macaulay in his description of the young Gladstone, in case you want to know what I'm talking about. And you see her natural empathy coming out for some of these characters. When the trans person is singing, she goes over and sort of strokes their shoulders and things like that. It's a sign of sympathy and empathy. So you see her unbending, and then she starts, as she feels comfortable amongst these people, she then starts telling them her story, which is that she was in a loveless marriage, and she was raised a long time ago and beaten by her parents, who were even more sort of stern and religiously unbending than she was. She was sort of punished for being a girl because women are the original sin, or responsible for the original sin. There's all that kind of stuff. She tells terrible stories. Whether this is true, I suspect it's not. I can't imagine any of this stuff would ever have come out in any story about Mary Whitehouse. She wouldn't have told these stories, so I can't believe they're true.
It's a reading. Really.
It is, yeah. But that when she had her first period as a teenager, she was punished for it, and it was a matter of shame, which of course we know that isn't now the case. So there's a lot of sympathy there. And then we get to the point which I would have listed as the thing I found hardest. Having been encouraged to like this version of Mary, and I came to feel some sympathy for her and understood her, she's then introduced to the world of sex, and we have this very odd scene where essentially she is persuaded to go off into another room where on the mic, so we only hear this, thank the Lord.
Over the speakers.
It is, oh yeah.
It's pre-recorded.
Yeah, but we hear it, that's
yes,
the point.
We do.
And I've got to say this, what we hear is Mary Whitehouse, who's not a young woman, not that that makes a difference, but we're hearing an upper middle-aged woman being fingered to climax by another woman in the room off, i.e. off stage, all the way up to, so it's not suggested, we actually hear,
yes,
simulated I rather imagine, Mary Whitehouse climax over a microphone. Oddly, and this is, bearing in mind I don't have a great deal of time for the morality, and this is where we touched on this earlier, of the actual Mary Whitehouse, I still found it quite difficult to square, even though I've been made to like the fictional Mary Whitehouse on the stage, whether it's quite right to take someone who had the views that Mary Whitehouse actually did and then place on stage the idea of them having an orgasm. I still struggle with that. I appreciate it works in the piece and it's the unlocking of her sexual side, so it has a narrative function, she has to do it, and then that allows her then to become this reformed Mary who sees the joy of sex, but it's going to come down like a ton of bricks on anyone who abuses that position. You know, that's her journey. I still think that I could not get the real Mary Whitehouse out of my head. Not someone I madly respect, but I respect her enough as an individual human to think that was a little bit... That took me into a zone which I thought was just a touch too distasteful. And I wondered if they could have suggested that in a different way without us actually listening to the actress pretending to orgasm on a microphone. That's only my position. This could be a whole series of squeamish things in me. It may very well be much more my issue. But I did think I had very little in common with Mary Whitehouse. I had very little to find to respect about Mary Whitehouse and her position. But actually I still think the human dignity of taking a real person...
The thing is, you do remember her.
I do.
And I don't know her. I'm
yes,
sure.
We are in a different world for you and I.
So I'm trying to think if there's someone similar that I can put in her place and how I would feel about that. I'm sure there probably are. Yeah, and that's I'll have to ruminate on that.
Yes, maybe dark ruminate.
Maybe.
Yes. However, we spent a lot of time on that because actually that show turned out to be... I mean, I found it very enjoyable, and I did actually think the narrative was able to, for something that was a spoof, and it advertised itself as a spoof musical, it found a way of making that character, the fictionalised version, sympathetic in some way. Yeah. Even if I think it's nonsense. There was also one other point I really liked. There's a character who wanders around all the time wearing a leather dog mask and a thong, who is then revealed to be Hugh Carlton Green, and they have this, at the end he takes off his mask and they hug, it's, oh, it was you all along, and you think, oh, this is his clever plan to reform Mary so that she's no longer a thorn in his side, but also help her to see a different way of living the world. It's so strange.
Yes, I'm so glad I saw it, and I'm so glad you saw it too.
Well, I remember you came out of that almost when we saw each other very shortly after you'd seen it, and you were sort of bubbling with excitement.
Yes.
And said you've got to see it. So it wasn't a show I was going to see, so I did it on your recommendation, and I don't regret it.
Good.
Yes. So you won't be hearing from my solicitor.
Well, from a cast of adults in an adult spoof to a cast of children in what I thought was a charming 45 minutes.
Yes.
We have to talk about Behind the Curtain, which is a very different show.
100%.
Why don't you start?
Yeah, it's let's put it this way. It's much more 42nd Street than it is a street in the red light district.
It's 42nd Street.
It's essentially 42nd Street. Basically, it's a British musical, a youth musical with a youth cast. They were mostly teenage boys and girls, mostly girls, 2 or 3 boys. And the plot is that at the beginning of the show, a young woman is behind the stage. They're all preparing for some kind of show, and she's been sent to work on the stage. She actually wants to be an actress, but she didn't succeed in the audition for whatever reason. and she's been sent to work backstage, but no one's told her what to do. So she's asking people, and she's finding out what they're doing.
Yeah.
But we don't actually ever find out what it is she's been asked to do, what function she might have behind the stage. So she's a little bit of a lone character. She wanders around behind the stage. So she meets all the techies, basically, all the people who work behind the stage, and she discovers 40
of them.
Yeah, and there were lots, big cast. And she sees all their little sort of dynamics. So she spots that, I can't remember, one's the electrician, and one is the costume designer, I think.
But costume and props. Or something
it's costume and props. That's right. Who are loggerheads? They barely talk to each other, but of course they need to talk to each other. So there's this unresolved animosity between these two characters, and she inadvertently is able to sort of help solve their problem. There is a MacGuffin plot point where people are being asked to find batteries because they need them for a microphone pack. And batteries do occasionally turn up, but then they're immediately snatched for other things. It's like batteries are the gold dust of this world. Quite amusing in this. There's another kind of wandering lone character who has even less function than she does, which is a young man. Yeah. And he sort of wanders around, and he's also accepted by the stage community, but he's not there to do any function, and he's not even there as someone who would have been an actor. He just seems to be there. And he's accepted, if you like, almost like the court jester. So he sort of makes comments, he judges, he observes, he tells her what's going on. So, if you like, he is the passive interpreter of what we're seeing to her, and she then, deliberately or otherwise, is able to solve all the problems. So it's lots of little vignettes and anecdotes. The big plot, which is laid on this, is the 42nd Street plot. There is a diva-ish actress with some hangers-on who comes in and treats everyone absolutely disdainfully, but her hangers-on treat her as though she's gold, and everyone else goes, bleh, her again. And then she inadvertently says something terribly rude, because the microphone is still on, about everyone, all and sundry, including, I think, the director and things like that, who up to that point had sort of promoted her and helped her. And there's this joke that because she treats the electrics people, the sparks, so badly, who run the microphones, who've been trying to tell her, you've got a microphone which is live, she just keeps being batted away. It's because of her own rudeness to that person that she's caught saying what she says. She's immediately taken off the cast. But there's no one to put on the show. Oh no, but hang on, strange woman who's just been sent round to do this.
Weren't you terrible in the audition and we didn't pick you? You're on.
You're on. Exactly. So she's Peggy Sawyer, essentially. Yeah. So it is 42nd Street at 2 or 3 removes. But there's nothing in it that wasn't charming.
I enjoyed it, and actually we've spoken about this before, in that I'm kind of indifferent to children's shows. As in, I don't mean children's shows, I mean shows with cast of children. I think it's a very hard thing to do in Edinburgh, because they're competing against quasi-professionals, student professionals, West End stars, and I thought they were top-notch, really.
I think the thing that really carried it all the way through was the fact that it was so charming. It really was. Everyone was
a well-written show.
Yeah, and everyone put in their performance nicely. They weren't always top-notch performances, but somehow they managed to get the emotion right.
I remember there's a moment where she reenacts her audition, and they all put on glasses and moustaches, and they're kind of leaning over the piano. Or there's a fake piano at some. I can't even remember. But I just remember thinking, their faces are brilliant. They know what they're doing. They're just having fun.
It was a good show.
Yeah.
But as I say, 42nd Street on a budget, basically.
Yes.
I'm trying to work out that would be 20 and a half Street.
Yes.
Well, I enjoyed that. And but there was another show that we saw, at least from the same, set in the same decade as 42nd Street.
That's
is the
true,
connection.
yes.
Called Wallis.
Yes.
And for people who don't know who we are talking about here, this is not Anne Gromit. It's not Wallis Beery. It's not any other famous Wallis except Wallis Simpson. Wallis. A new British musical about, and I want to tap into what you think it's about in a minute, but about Wallis Simpson meeting the Prince of Wales, who's then going to become Edward VIII, and then the abdication crisis. Yeah. So we're set in 1932 to 1936. It's quite specific. And it takes place in lots of high-class venues. We start at a party where they're introduced. She's married to Ernest Simpson, an American millionaire, but who's also part British and served as a British soldier. So they introduced into polite society. They meet the Prince of Wales. And then over time you see the Prince of Wales and Wallis get closer. and other people get jettisoned. Ernest for one, but also I think her name was Lady. Oh, I can't remember. A member of the aristocracy who's sort of the king, who's the prince's squeeze, gets jettisoned quite quickly. And so, there's a quite brutal moment where she puts a call through to the Prince of Wales, and it's told by the operator that he's not prepared to accept the call. This is after she's been away in America for a couple of months, and he's got closer to Wallis.
Sabotaging.
Well, this is what I'd like to know what you think this play is trying to do. What this musical with some excellent score.
Tweet, 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 tweet.
Well, right. In case people are wondering what's happened to you, there was a recurring song which was about the switchboard operators, which were manually operated by telephone girls in those days, putting you through now, sir. Beautifully done, and it was called Tweetbird or something like that, wasn't
something it? Like that. But and again, very on style in terms of
2030s.
Three women. It was two men as well, but it kind of had that close harmony barbershop. Not really barbershop. But
earlier Andrew Sisters, the 30s sound rather than the 40s sound.
Yes.
But yes, absolutely. Very much, very correct. Right, I've now got two questions for you.
Yes.
What did that song represent to you? Because I have a very distinct view that it's trying to do something.
That recurring idea.
Yeah.
What do I think that song was?
Was it just a song about telephone operators?
I think primarily, yes.
You see, I think it has. I think that represents. I think it's doing two things. I could be completely wrong and reading too much into this, but I think that song is symbolising gossip circulating first in the court environment,
because they can hear
and in
it.
Society they can hear it, and that's how it gets out, because they're listening in on the calls, because that's how operators used to work. And these are the private calls from the Prince of Wales to Wallis Simpson to Ernest, so they can hear everything that's going on and all the characters in that society. There's a lovely man who's a kind of Noel Coward character called Fruity.
Yeah,
he was actually called Fruity. It's quite marvellous. He comes in with bow ties and bon mots, and he and I think, therefore, that the reason we see it over and over again is that is telling us that what we've just seen narratively is being circulated into polite society and then the newspapers, so everyone is aware of what's going on. And it also has the second meaning of the word tweet. Now, I know we don't have Twitter anymore, but that is a way of circulating gossip. It's called X, but it's the same thing. I think there's a clever parallel being suggested here, that the telephone operators are the way that gossip is circulated, and it is the 1930s equivalent of a technological gossip circulation system that we would now call Twitter.
And is that historically accurate in that was gossip being spread at the time? Through newspapers.
There were injunctions on the newspapers to stop them reporting, but you could read about it in the European and the American press, and people were reading the American press to find out what was going on. Because newspapers will find back and forth.
There's a plot point about the American press, yes.
That's right. And then it's only when it becomes a political matter and they need to dislodge the prince who's now become the king, then the informal injunction, it's informal, the moratorium might be a better way of putting it, is removed. So that's that song, and it's a recurring song, and it's a great song. But I still want to go back to, what is Wallis about? What do you think the purpose of that piece is? Let's hear what you want to say, and then
I perceived it as a love story about Wallis and about the incumbent king choosing love over country.
But can I ask you a question? What is the role that Wallis plays in it? And the reason I ask this, let me give you a sort of area where I'm thinking about.
Help me out, Thos.
Well, it's not so much that.
Tee me up.
But there is a thing here. I'm considerably older than you, and I have a handle on 1930s British politics and history, and I'm interested, and I have a view on Wallis Simpson. Wallis Simpson was alive in my lifetime, and I remember the day she died. It was in the 1980s, I think. Edward had died in 1973, so I was alive, but I don't remember it. But I remember when the Duchess of Windsor, as she was known after the abdication crisis, dying in Paris, and it was front page newspapers all over the world. That's the hold and the sway this woman had. She was always an enigma to a degree, but in Britain there's always been a position about her, which is the orthodox position, which is that she manipulated her way into the king, let's call him that, affections, certainly the prince's affections, and then he became king. And the story is generally that the Prince of Wales, whilst charming, was a weak man, would have been a disastrous king. She was a manipulator, and she barged people out of the way to get to him, get her claws into him, with a view to becoming queen, which was then thwarted by the abdication crisis. So it got rid of 2 bad eggs in one go. And you either buy into that Wallis was a big manipulator and doing it for her own advantage and was not a great asset, or you think that actually this is all a travesty. Basically, are you in favour of the abdication or are you not? I have always taken a particular position which is less favourable to Wallis Simpson and more favourable to what actually happened. The establishment position, if you like, but it seems to me, having looked at it historically, that seems most likely. I have a view about Wallis Simpson. You are a good generation younger than me. I don't know if you have a view about Wallis Simpson. I've also spoken about this with Mike Shapiro as an American citizen who also doesn't particularly have a view about Wallis Simpson. And of course, the minutiae of now extremely old British constitutional politics is not something that a 21st century person is necessarily going to be interested in unless they're interested in British history. Yeah. So I wonder what your view of Wallis Simpson is. Did you go into this musical having a view about Wallis Simpson and what she represents, or were you an open book on Wallis Simpson? And therefore, is the musical saying to you, I'm going to tell you the position of Wallis Simpson either from one position or the other, or is it saying, I'd like you to make an opinion on Wallis Simpson on the story that's being presented to you?
I was more or less an open book. Really, my only 2 references were the King's Speech, which starts with
the film,
the King's Speech film, which starts with the king abdicating. So it's very much an incidental part. It's the catalyst for the film, but it's incidental in that sense.
Yes, it's a trigger for the story of George VI, in fact. Yes.
Yeah,
and his ascent to kinghood, which wasn't always assured. Yes.
So if I use that as my first influence, Wallis Simpson had always seemed as a kind of, it's a throwaway part. The focus is now on George VI, in that sense. Edward. No, whoever took over.
Oh, George VI. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah. Fine. Oh, you mean she was immediately nullified by the new king?
So,
yes. Well, that's true.
How the film starts.
Yeah.
My only other reference is the "I'm Still Here" lyric, William Wands's affair.
Oh, from Sondheim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, those are my only 2 references, really.
So you didn't go in with a view.
No.
You know that she's historically important, but you know nothing of her really.
And I guess I was mildly curious to see if this was based in any kind of reality, and I don't know how much of a degree that it was, but it was kind of fun to watch this tough woman in not too happy a marriage, or at least didn't seem like one, work her way through the ranks of the aristocracy to try and win someone over.
So you did interpret it that way? Did you think she was...
I didn't feel that she was... I mean, to be honest, my opinion on this is if you're able to get through the front door and get up to the ranks of into the royal family, my hat goes off to you, to be quite honest. I don't think she's...
Only to be replaced with a crown, surely.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do, yeah. I do.
So, in that sense, if she was a manipulator, and if she sabotaged, and if she backstabbed people, fine. There are plenty of people around in all walks of life who do that, I think.
But did you think that the story was telling you that she did, or they were offering you up the facts at one level, obviously at one remove because it's a musical, for you to make a judgment on?
Well, it portrayed Edward as a bit of a wet flannel, I think.
Yeah.
So I think the easy assumption is that he's weak, she's strong.
Yeah.
She pulls him.
Did you see ruthlessness in the piece? And if you did see ruthlessness in the piece, where was it coming from? Was it her?
I saw the ruthlessness in her prior relationship. I thought, that's
with
tough.
Ernest.
That's tough that she's doing that. But if you're, again, maybe I don't think she did. She might have not done it for love at all. But she clearly wasn't in a happy
situation. Yeah, and he was relatively acquiescent up until quite late. Yeah, so it's almost condoned. I mean, I like the complexity of the piece. The reason I asked that question about what you think the piece is trying to achieve is, I think, fundamental. And this comes from a conversation I had with Mike Shapiro. Doesn't really know the story either. For him, a musical about Wallis Simpson, and she is the title character, would have a very strong want song for that character early on. And he was disappointed from his point of view that Wallis was not portrayed more profoundly, but she wasn't really the centre of the story, because it was a whole group of people moving in those 1930s circles, and she seems to rise to the top like cream, and you see the effects of that, like the Duchess character being basically ghosted, to use the modern phrase, by the prince, and Ernest deciding actually that he's meeting someone else and that it's time to move on, but not until such a point. You see the collateral damage, but you don't see the act that creates the collateral damage. So she's almost a ghost in her own story from his point of view. I took the complete opposite point of view, which is I went into it with a view of what Wallis Simpson is, and therefore for me I thought the piece was quite trying to say, we are going to give you the story of Wallis Simpson. It's for you to
story.
Well, it's for you to interpret. So it wasn't a daggers out story. You could interpret her that she was just a piece of social flotsam that happened to rise to the top, or you could interpret it that actually she had her eye on the prize right from the beginning and was going to manipulate that situation. And then you went in with your own prejudices and viewpoints and saw what you wanted to see, or if you didn't, you went in and were then able to make your position on it. But for Mike, he really didn't like what he saw as the absence of Wallis in her own musical, where I really liked the fact that she was the cipher in a room full of people, and you had to impose upon her either from your own knowledge or what you were being offered up. So for me, this is a show where you had to walk in with something to get something out. But you didn't, because you don't have that Wallis information. So I wondered how you see that in the light of that prism.
I take Mike's point of view, and I think I was so taken by just how enjoyable a show it was that I kind of forgot that it didn't really have an I Want song, or we're not really given a motivation for Wallis doing anything.
It's not presented to us overtly.
Yeah. But for me, the score was great. The guy on the piano, I don't know if he's the composer.
Richard Lister was the chap on the piano. I don't think he's the composer, but he was terrific. Charismatic to look at as well.
And the cast was really fun. And for 10:40 on whatever morning it was that I saw it, I was really pleased by it. So, but I would really value revisiting that. And if there were a video recording, I'd love to watch that with all of that in mind now.
But it's really interesting to hear that position from you, but you really enjoyed it at the time. It's only now we've been talking about it you think actually maybe she could have been portrayed or written more strongly.
There are a lot of moving parts in that, and I think when you've got a musical that has lots of characters, and I mean I don't mean in the sense that with Reject Me Already, where we had incidental characters. Actually, all of the characters were fundamental in a sense.
They were,
in that they had motivations or things going on, or they were chess pieces on the chessboard. I think if you've got a musical like that, you have to be very careful with what songs you give what characters. Just because you have character X, you have to be careful. The I Want song can really only go to one character. You also don't want to have too many solo songs. You have to have duets. You have to have trios. There is no real logic to a musical sometimes, but you kind of just have to have variety for variety's sake. And if all of the songs are "This Is What I Am" song, then
it's not.
It becomes very. I'm not that I'm saying that this is what Wallis does.
Oh no, not at all.
But I wonder, actually, now in hindsight, if one of its flaws were that it had too many ballads from the forefront characters.
That's interesting.
We had an Ernest ballad. We had incumbent King ballad. I think we probably had more than one from him. What I mean to say is, I think there needs to be more variety in the songs.
I would question the one area I would have liked to have seen a song for is the abdication, or the crisis that leads up to the abdication, because that feels like something that could be set very nicely. They do an excellent thing whereby the actor starts saying the words of the actual abdication speech, which was heard on the radio in 1936, on the Wireless, I should say, on the BBC Home Service, and then they cut in the actual recording of the King, Edward VIII, abdicating, And what's wonderful is the actor's got the rhythms of the sound very similar. He's doing a good job there. But I can't help but feel the abdication itself is something that perhaps could be musicalised. Or you have the recording and then you have the musicalisation of the emotional response to that, because obviously it's a very stiff upper lip kind of speech as for something so emotional. So you just think there must be a world of editorial and footnotes the King could have made about it. Yes, there's an opportunity for a song there. But I remember you saying, because you saw it before I did, once again, you said this is really great, and you will find that the songs are much more sophisticated perhaps than they need to be, with triple rhymes was the very thing you said. You were very impressed on the craft.
Yeah.
Rightly so, in my
almost opinion. Unnecessarily well written, but I don't mean really unnecessarily.
You didn't mean that negatively. You were saying this was such a surprise because of the quality.
Yeah, and the songs were of really good quality.
Well, thank you, Colm, for talking about that. I don't want to abdicate responsibility for our listeners here on Musical Talk. We could, of course, talk about every musical that we saw, but I think for the time being we've given a very interesting set of thumbnail sketches for a whole bunch of shows, which show the variety that we saw. So, as I say, without making an abdication speech, I now declare you to be the king of Musical Talk as I leave this episode. You may also want to abdicate immediately after me, but Colm, it's great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Thos.
Musical Talk. And there we are, 3 very different shows in the company of Colm Malloy. We heard about Mary Mary Quite Contrary, we heard about Behind the Curtain, and we heard about Wallis. And I hope you enjoyed our discussions about the very different feels that were being offered up by those shows. And as I said at the beginning of this programme, Wallis is particularly a musical to watch out for, and it is my hope that it goes on to further performances here, there and everywhere. So keep an eye out for it. Wallis. That's Wallis, and not to be confused with And Gromit, one of the great Christmas institutions here in the United Kingdom. And as I also said, in the new year you'll be able to hear some further episodes where we discuss that show with some of the creative people behind it. And also with the wonderful Michael Gordon Shapiro, who gives us an American perspective on a very British story. So plenty to join us in 2025 for here on Musical Talk. But we're not quite finished yet, so do join us again next week, or whenever, and listen to that next episode of Musical Talk to see what it's all about. You never can tell. And, as suggested by Mary Mary Quite Contrary, that musical had, and I quote, a speech marks happy ending, close speech marks, and we all know what that means. Let's instead offer you something a little bit more normal here to close this episode of Musical Talk. I like quite often to quote the song So Long, Farewell, Auf Wiedersehen, Goodbye. I think today the more appropriate song from which to quote would be We Wish You a Merry Christmas. Now, where is my figgy pudding? Because I won't go until I've got some. Ah, here it is. Quite a heavy mixture this year, I see. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, presented by Colm Malloy and Thos Ribbits, and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2024. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on the usual social media networks like Facebook, Instagram and X, formerly known as Twitter. And if you want to follow me on the latter, you can. At Musical Talk Thos.
Tweet, 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 tweet. Word.